keep it to only urgent things or very specific questions, so we're not having any distractions throughout the presentation. Okay, so a quick introduction of our first speaker, Kyley Canion Brewer, who is a senior in the history major and getting a minor in political science. My cat has decided to join us. I'm sorry. So Kyley is a major in history and minoring in political science, and has been working under the mentorship of Kevin Hatfield, an adjunct professor in history, as well as the assistant director of academic initiatives and history and resident life. Kyley's project is titled Points in Play, Reacting Student Engagement in the Evolving College Classroom. The project explores role-playing exercises in higher education, educational pedagogy that flips the classroom and encourages students to take more active roles in their education. Without any further ado, Kyley, the floor is yours.
Okay, I suppose I'll turn my camera on then. Hi, I'm going to try to share my screen. I haven't done this before, so my laptop might. Yeah, I don't have the ability to share screen right now.
I will go do that for you. One moment. I think I get to promote you. Do you have the ability now?
Yep, that's better. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, is that working?
Yes.
There we go. That should be normal, right? Yes. Okay, cool. Hi, my name is Kyley. As you've already said, my project is called Points in Play, and it addresses student engagement and the college classroom. My project really centers around rewriting a reacting to the past game. So reacting to the past, which I will shorten to RTTP or reacting through the course of this presentation, just because it's simpler, is a active learning pedagogy that gives students more agency in their education. So it's a way for students to learn through play, which means that it's a curriculum taught through games. What this project does is it takes a pre-existing game, Red Clay, 1835, Cherokee Removal and the Meaning of Sovereignty, written by Jason Laura Weaver, and it addresses some of the issues that we found as we've tried to teach this game in the college classroom. Largely what it's going to focus on is rewriting specific student role sheets to allow them to engage more in the class. So without further ado, Reacting to the past is founded on 4 key tenets. These are communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking. In that way, the best practice for this project meant that I could not change the base function of each role. I could not change the balance of power between different factions. Those students have individual role sheets and individual roles. They work together in factions and teams to achieve objectives over the course of the class or the game, as it would be called. It's very important that the balance of power doesn't shift in this, otherwise the historical plausibility of the narrative at the end could be counterfactual. The historical context of each role must also be respected. Many of the roles are based on historical characters, and those that aren't, we call composite characters, are made of a group of smaller actual historical people. So it's really important that we respect their biographies and their histories as we write these role sheets. Red Clay, which I'll shorten to RC, and the University of Oregon. I'm going to shorten it to RC just because it is a very long title and it's a bit more convenient to say RC as we go through. Specifically in terms of this project here at University of Oregon, there was a challenge in that the class is taught at both a lower division course level and a higher division course level. As a lower division course, it's taught as History 211, but it's also taught at a higher division course, sometimes just a normal history class or sometimes an honors college class. And those have really different requirements. The curriculum requirements are really different there. So in lower division courses, students are coming in with a kind of standardized contextual knowledge. They are taking the same classes. Most of what they know pertaining to the game will be the same. But at a higher division course, students are coming in with their own contextual knowledge, their own research experience, and they're able to apply that in different ways, which means at the same time as we change this game, we have to have enough simplicity that it can be played at a lower division, but enough complexity that students at a higher division aren't going to be discouraged from engaging the same way. The game itself is designed to recreate the Treaty of New Echota in 1835. The Treaty of New Echota precedes the Cherokee Nation being forcibly removed into the Western Territory of the United States, which resulted in the Trail of Tears and the death of almost 4,000 Cherokee citizens. Sorry, this is a really weird way to do a presentation. In this way, students are urged while they play to think about their actions as having real world effects. And we encourage them to think about every decision they make in that game as affecting the lives of these people who were caught in the situation historically. The game itself is divided into 4 primary factions to do this. One faction represents the federal legislators. This is called the white faction. One faction is called the rich faction, which represents those who were willing to be removed in a way that they knew that refusing to sign a treaty for removal would potentially result in more death. And then there was another group, the Ross faction, who believed indelibly that sovereignty was tied to land, and so that by being removed, they were giving up their sovereignty and their cultural identity. The 4th and final faction, which is very important to this project, is the indeterminate Cherokee members. So these are members of the Cherokee National Council, who are the players in the game predominantly. And these don't really represent a specific team ideology so much, but they're able to be swayed and determined, and they're kind of the playing pieces of the game, where their fellow students need to convince them over to one side or another to sway the vote that makes that's kind of the key point of the game. To do this, we have students focus on several key sources. In the lower division classes, this is obviously narrowed down more than it is in the higher division classes, where students are encouraged to do a lot of outside research. But some of the primary sources that we use are the Indian Removal Act and Worcester versus Georgia. And of course, the original Treaty of New Echota. We encourage students to consider what the original document said and use that to kind of contextualize what their decisions will be as they play this game and as they're learning this class, the content matter. In this way, it's quite important when rewriting the game. These are the sources that I'd had to draw back on a lot in rewriting the rules to make sure that everything we put in the revised rule sheets was plausible. So the primary problem we encountered, and this is what this project really focuses on, is something called the point system. In several of the students' role sheets, there is a mention of points. So in every RTTP game or every reacting game, students have victory objectives that help them kind of figure out what they need to do over the course of the class to be successful. And through doing those tasks, that's how they get the information they need. The points are a problem because for several students, they're mentioned as a key victory objective, but there's no explanation for what these are. This is possible because each RTTP game is published again and again and again as it's revised until it is considered appropriate to publish as a book form. It's quite possible that the points were originally a much bigger part of the game and were taken down as the game got edited through. The issue with the points is that while some students had them and some students didn't, and they weren't explained, there were students who weren't able to engage with the class at the same level as everybody else, or who felt alienated and isolated from that learning experience. Obviously, this isn't ideal because the point of this class is to encourage students to take control of their learning, and when they don't have the ability to do that, obviously RTTP doesn't have the same effect in encouraging their engagement in the class and encouraging their connection to the subject matter. So what we had to resolve was where these points fit in with each specific character and how they fit in the game as a whole. I'll be using 4 characters in this presentation to kind of explain how we did that. These are Jacob Adair and Thomas Dreadfulwater, which fit into the indeterminate faction I mentioned earlier, Wilson Lumpkin, who represents the white faction, and Major Ridge, who represents the Ridge faction. The Ross faction, the 4th faction, who was anti-removal, is actually doesn't mention points at all. So that was very convenient, and we had to find a way to resolve that, but because their roles were so refined, it wasn't really necessary for us to include that in this project. The potential solutions that we encountered were either to convert all the points to votes. Votes are a really important part of this game because voting on the final treaty is what makes this game work. Creating a new point structure from scratch, or eliminating points without replacement. All of these have pros, but many of them have cons as well. If we eliminate points without replacement, what do we do with the students whose primary victory objectives center around points? if we convert points to votes, how does that throw off the historical accuracy of how the tree is going to go over? After a lot of careful consideration, I chose a hybrid model wherein, sorry, my screen just went blank. Wherein points could be eliminated where possible, added where necessary, and in special cases, they could grant special powers, which are quantifiable as votes. So they did still impact the game, but in a lesser way than they would have if we had just converted all points to votes entirely. This worked better because each faction also had their own requirements for points. In going through the roll sheets in depth, I noticed that one specific roll sheet, actually the one of Walter Cummingdeer, which is one of the Ross faction roll sheets, mentions the points specifically as influence points, which gave me the idea to kind of restructure the point system to allow students to use them as a measure of where they stood politically in the game. The idea was that the more influence students had, the more power. And the more power they had, the more votes they were able to sway. And votes are the ultimate currency of the red clay game, because that's what ultimately impacts the decision made in the Treaty Council sessions. This allows students to engage more without kind of corrupting the base of the game as it was designed by Jace Weaver, because we wanted it to stay true to however Mr. Weaver originally imagined the game. The image on this slide is actually one of the ways we had to do that to make sure the balance was maintained, was to go through all the roll sheets at once and color code everything so that we could make sure the relationships to different characters were carefully considered in each points. The point system acted as a kind of an alternate currency so that students could communicate with each other who didn't necessarily have voting ability. So one of the ways we did that was to make sure that each faction had all of the connections to other factions dictated in terms of points. So we had to go through each role individually as well as a group. So in terms of character focus, a lot of the factions look similar. For example, for the Ridge faction, the way we reconciled the point system was as a maintenance of influence points. So rather than gaining or losing points, students simply had to maintain their starting value of points to win or achieve their victory objective. This adds weight to their political decisions because everything they do might impact how they're viewed by others, which could result in more points or less points. And this just allowed the students in the Ridge faction to really consider the impact that their actions have, because with just the votes itself, sometimes it's hard to imagine that, whereas influence points are more immediate because they give you immediate powers. One of my personal favorite changes we made was to Wilson Lumpkin's role, who was the governor of Georgia at the time. Historically, Wilson Lumpkin was threatening the Cherokee a lot during the New Dakota Treaty, saying like, oh, we're going to invade if you don't accept these offers. And that's something that didn't really feature in the Red Clay game as much. And while students could involve that with their own outside research, it wasn't something that was very prevalent. So one of the things we did to make sure Wilson Lumpkin was more engaged in the class as a character was to add an influence point threshold that opens a special power wherein at the end of the game they can invade Cherokee land. Just to remind them that they have that power, but also to remind them that they have to have a certain amount of gravitas to be able to make that happen. And that was actually a very fun change that we made. Wilson Lumpkin was definitely a lot more engaged in that class once we had put that in. The final two, Adair and Dreadful Water, started off as very independent roles, but the way we reworked the game, their role sheets are now identical. So as we were going through and reading them, we realized that their roles were identical in function, but one was much more difficult than the other, which wasn't fair to the students trying to do those roles side by side. And these are the two roles that are most impacted by points because their victory objectives center around points and only points. They don't have the same victory objectives or votability or faction influences that other characters, other students have in this game. So their characters, Adair and Dreadful Water, need full rewrites when we implemented, this is where we implemented a new set of rules for the influence points, where they had to take bribes by using their influence points to make those bribes more successful or less successful. If they were caught, they would lose influence points. If they weren't, they might gain influence points. Depending on the size of their bribe, that could change as well. And that was one way that we dealt with that for the indeterminate faction particularly. The results of the altered game were predominantly positive. So we did actually trial this. We did this project in real time with a class last term. And the results were fairly positive. Students were definitely more engaged. Once we had altered the roles of the indeterminates played a much bigger part in the game. The only con in that is that because the roles of the indeterminates were made so similar, they were able to function as a block. And if the indeterminate students function as a block, this upsets the balance of power in the game, allowing them to move much more quickly in one direction or another, which typically changes the way compromises are made in the game. Now, ultimately, students should compromise, but they don't want to compromise immediately off the bat. So having such similar indeterminate roles made that quite difficult. Of course, having too much distinction in the indeterminates prevents them from actually engaging in the class. So it's about finding that balance. So though overall the point system was definitely improved, that's something that we would want to change moving forward, which brings us to projections moving forward. We need to make sure that students have more distinct role sheets in the future. So though we've made these changes and these changes will be played again in the future, one thing that I'm trying to resolve before fall is making sure that Dreadful Water and Adair have distinct differences in their role sheets to allow them to work as individuals and less as a group. And this is a really important thing that features in a lot of RTTP games. I know there's some RTTP games where students actually only have faction role sheets. They don't have individual role sheets. And when that happens, students are a lot more willing to compromise and a lot less willing to conform to the rules of the game or to take agency in their own learning. So that's something that we would want to do moving forward. But so far, that has been the result of my project. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. At this point, we just want to open up the floor for questions and see if any of our attendees or other participants want to ask Kyley any questions about her research or projects.
Yeah, I would love to ask a question. First of all, I thought your presentation was amazing and you did an amazing job presenting. And the research was incredibly interesting. I'm curious as to what motivated you to start this research and what was the inspiration?
Thanks, Monica. So I've been a preceptor, which is kind of like an undergraduate TA for a lot of RTTP classes since I started school. I took RTTP through a FIG in my very first year and just fell in love with it, basically. And I noticed the same problem recurring over the 2 years that I taught that specific class. And it's such a bummer to see what happens when students can't engage. So ultimately, I knew that before I graduated, I want to do something to remedy this for future classes to make sure that everybody had the same experience in RTTP that I know is possible and I know that myself and my class had. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it did.
Okay.
I'm wondering what your next steps are. You've mentioned that you want to continue testing out the new rules that you're adding to the game since finding out after your first trial run what needs to be tweaked. And when are you going to do that?
So this class will be hopefully, if we're in person, taught again in fall. Although I'm fortunately graduating, I won't be on campus again next year. So it will be interesting, but I do plan to do a full write-up of my project. I have all the original paperwork and the original reprinted roll sheets, as well as just a very clear implementation of why I did what I did, and I'll be passing that on to the preceptor who takes my place to continue that research. I, of course, will have suggestions because I've done this before, but ultimately the direction it takes will be up to them.
Very cool. Are you, you're writing it up specifically for the next person's use, or are you going to try to publish any of this anywhere or get in contact with the original game creator?
I would love to do all those things. It'll all depend on how much time I have after I graduate.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, it's good to have more ideas and more opportunity, right?
Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience right now? Okay, well, Kyley, if you could hold on, I do feel like there are going to be some parallels between your and Monica's work that I think will lead to some interesting panel discussion. So if you could hold on, and we'll transition over to Monica at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So a quick introduction of Monica. Monica Silverman is a senior in the International Studies program who's also minoring in Spanish. She's been working with Professor Yvonne Braun from the International Studies Department to create her project titled Abortion Legalization in Spain, a window into the history of Spanish reproductive rights. This project is an analysis of the social and political history of abortion legalization in Spain and explores the implications of this history for modern reproductive health discourse and policy throughout the country. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much. To share screen, let me just, how exactly is sharing screen done? I can't seem to share my screen.
Oh, sorry, I had myself muted. If you hover over at the bottom of your Zoom page, do you have a bar that pops up with a green share screen button?
Yes, and I'm clicking that. I'm struggling to, Zoom is not letting me share my screen. So when I click it, it says desktop 1, whiteboard. I'm assuming it's desktop 1.
Correct.
And then I click that and nothing happens.
Monica, this is Abby speaking. I will, I'm working on this for you to try to see if I can figure it out for you as well, okay?
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I should introduce Abby, our second moderator, has been able to make it on, and is our tech guru for the day.
Mm-hmm. Is it, I believe it's sharing now.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Okay, well, my name's Monica, and my research is on reproductive rights in Spain. So after I studied for a year in Segovia, Spain, from 2018 to 2019, learning about Spanish culture and Spanish history had become a passion of mine. I found that the experience of learning in an intercultural setting sparked a deep passion for learning about global issues cross-culturally. Both in class and in my non-classroom interactions, I found myself coming into contact with stories relating to Spain's history of civil war and dictatorship. Spain had experienced a civil war between 1936 to 1939, which was followed by an extremely oppressive dictatorship, which lasted 40 years under the rule of Francisco Franco. Many people were killed and experienced violence during the war and in the years following. Obviously, this dictatorship and the policies it implemented has had a huge impact on Spanish culture and politics. Upon returning to the University of Oregon for my senior year and continuing to study the Franco dictatorship, I wanted to know more about how the dictatorship had affected modern-day Spanish policy. Specifically, my passion for global reproductive rights led me to specify my research using the framework of reproductive healthcare services in Spain. One of the reproductive rights issues that has been most widely politicized in Spain in recent years is abortion legalization. Abortion was first legalized in Spain in 2010. To me, this seemed surprising at first, knowing that many other Western European countries had legalized abortion earlier on. And so abortion legalization policy served as a window into Spanish reproductive justice throughout my research. I sought to answer the question of what is the political history of abortion legalization in Spain and how is it connected to the Franco dictatorship. I also anticipated addressing the modern day implications of this history and providing a broader explanation of current barriers to reproductive healthcare justice in Spain. In conducting my research, I chose to take a historical approach. In doing this, I used secondary research, incorporating academic articles and books to inform the historical timeline, and to contextualize the discourse surrounding global reproductive health care. Examining Spain's history throughout the 20th and 21st centuries allowed me to critically examine the socio-political construction of reproductive health discourse in Spain by examining actors and political decisions which influence cultural beliefs. During the almost 40-year-long fascist dictatorship, gender roles and structures of patriarchy were present in education, government, family, and religion. The regime's close ties to the Catholic Church, as well as the Church's historical presence in Spanish society and government, has resulted in the framing of reproductive health care as a moral issue rather than as an intrinsic right. Presenting the research in a chronological format allowed me to show patterns that arise when governments address or don't address reproductive health. Using modern Spanish history as a paradigm for government limitation of reproductive rights, the theme of patriarchy pervading political power arose. I begin the historical timeline in 1931 Spain, the start of a period known as the Spanish Second Republic. This period of time is noteworthy because in the span of just 5 years between 1931 to 1936, a series of progressive policy initiatives were implemented by the Democratic Republic in power, many of which granted a wider range of reproductive rights and were able to empower women in the public sphere of society. Some of these policies included the allowing women to run for office, women's suffrage, and the legalization of divorce. Another reason this period is so vital to the timeline is because it shows how quickly progress can be stripped away. The Democratic Republic, Second Republic fell when Franco and a number of other military generals who would come to be known as the Nationalists led a military coup along with support from Hitler and Mussolini. This effectively led the country into a civil war. In the name of a nationalistic and anti-secularist cause, the Nationalists, who consisted of a number of different conservative, Catholic, and fascist groups, fought a bloody war against the Republicans. Once Franco gained power and the fascist regime prevailed in the war, all the progress that had been made under the Second Republic was reversed. After discussing the war in the historical timeline and explaining the important actors and outcomes in my paper, I transitioned to the structure and policies of Francoism. The guiding ideologies of the dictatorship were largely based on Catholic viewpoints and fascist ideals. The Catholic Church ran the education system of the country. In the paper, I show how using education as a tool, the regime is able to indoctrinate much of the population, especially children, with its propaganda on gender issues, gender roles, Catholicism, and defining a new Spanish identity. This identity excluded all different types of diversity. During this time, reproductive health care was virtually inaccessible. Abortion was illegal, as was divorce, contraception, and adultery, demonstrating the rollback of rights that had occurred under the Second Republic. The LGBTQ community was also criminalized under the regime. Restrictive policy which policed bodies and impeded equality remained throughout the almost 40-year period. In 1975, when Franco died and Spain transitioned to democracy, the government began to open up reproductive rights and services. However, ingrained Catholic ideologies within government and society continued to obstruct activist efforts in Spain to expand reproductive rights on a number of different social issues. In examining the transition to democracy in Spain starting in the late 1970s, I uncovered that the transition itself was strategically planned by Franco before he died. A document known as El Pacto de Olvido, which means the Pact of Forgetting, was signed by those in power to ensure that there would be no ramifications or legal action against the elites in government and society who had supported Franco and who had committed crimes of violence. The new democracy and rapid globalization process gave the illusion that progressive policy change would be a priority. It wasn't. This new government was essentially reliant on the collective forgetting of the violence and the repression that had happened during the war and throughout Francoism. many of the politicians and political parties who had had power under Franco remained in power throughout the democracy. Allowing the regime to live on in the structures of government made it an incredibly challenging process for activists fighting for social policy reform, especially in the realm of reproductive health services. Abortion was decriminalized in 1985, but would only be permitted in 3 situations, which included risk to the mother's health, fetal malformation, and cases of rape. Between 1985 and 2010, when abortion would finally be legalized, there was no abortion policy adjustments in Parliament and very few proposals. The few times when changes were proposed, it was entirely done by women in socialist and left-leaning political parties in Parliament. Moving into the 1990s and early 2000s in Spain, I explore new family planning services and clinics designed to integrate a right-centered approach into the healthcare system. The implementation of these services that was championed by Spanish feminist groups was also meant to widen access and attempted to decrease inequality in the realm of sexual and reproductive health care. While the research shows that many of these programs were somewhat successful in their implementation, healthcare institutions were still shaped by religious values. Healthcare workers were able to act upon their religious beliefs instead of supporting a secular and rights-centered approach to reproductive health care. Bringing the discussion into present day, I examined the law known as Organic Law 2010, which effectively legalized abortion in Spain as well as expanded reproductive rights. This was a huge success for Spanish feminist and reproductive rights-centered groups who had fought so long for abortion to be recognized as an essential healthcare service. It was also integral in starting to shift sexual education discourses. This law is still in place in Spain today, despite the numerous attempts by the conservative political party in Parliament to remove or to restrict the law's provisions. In fact, conservative politicians in government have introduced a number of bills trying to impose abortion access restrictions, which have actually all failed due to efforts by NGOs and activist coalitions in Spain. However, these set of reproductive rights, which include access to abortion, are still at risk. Even though currently the Socialist Party PSOE holds power in Spanish Parliament, the history has shown us that neither left-leaning nor right-leaning governments really prioritize reproductive health issues unless they're confronted by activist initiatives. Especially in times of crisis, reproductive rights are some of the first to be stripped away. Funding for reproductive healthcare services is reduced using the justification of economic or of political crisis. This is especially important to note given the current world crisis we're living through. Each section of Spanish history in this research project informs the timeline, but it also serves to emphasize different forms of political control enacted over reproductive rights. Reproductive health care includes quality of care, access to supplies, healthcare provider training, contraception, abortion, and education, among a wide range of other services. Restricting access to these services has been proven to increase health risks, death rates, and poverty rates disproportionately for women. I would like to reiterate that reproductive health care is health care. Communities suffer when they cannot access health care, and when health care is not a guarantee, it's the marginalized groups in society who experience barriers to access. Spain in its history doesn't exist within a bubble. Political power has hindered the advancement of reproductive rights in Spain, which raises the question as to where else these rights are being obstructed. Reproductive rights were officially recognized in the UN in 1995, and since then, international institutions and organizations have sought to better define these rights in order to ensure their implementation in governments around the world. However, the example of abortion legalization in Spain shows us that policies don't always reflect opinions and desires in a given society. It also illustrates that progressive policy around healthcare is not simply a product of the passing of time, but is reliant on strategic political organizing from groups championing these social issues. I hope that my research on this topic can add to the conversation around global reproductive healthcare. moving into a more justice-centered model of reproductive healthcare rather than a morality-centered model has the potential to create a more equitable world in which bodily autonomy is valued and can start to break apart repressive and patriarchal power dynamics. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I would also like to take this time to thank my advisor, Yvonne Braun, who has been such a guide and a mentor throughout this whole process. And I'm really excited to answer some questions now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Monica. That was a great presentation. Yeah, I want to open up the floor for questions from our audience first.
That was a great presentation, Monica. How do you think the current crisis will impact the current progressive policies in Spain today?
I definitely think it has the potential to go multiple directions. So as we've seen, and as I touched on in the presentation, economic crisis, political crisis is used as a justification. And it's really important that activists and us as a population show support for these issues. So I think in Spain specifically, given how hard the impact has been of coronavirus on Spanish society, I think we'll definitely see, especially in the coming years, maybe not immediately, but a rollback on reproductive rights that had occurred in the last 10 years because of patterns that we see throughout history. So I think only time will tell, but I think it's something that needs to be a present conversation throughout this crisis. It can't be pushed to the back burner.
Monica, did you do any research that was based like parallelly in the US as well?
In the US, I have not done any research in this specific thesis project on US reproductive rights. However, I have studied, my major is international studies with a focus on international gender issues. And right now I'm actually in a class, global reproductive health. So it's something I'm studying and would love to do more research on. But I chose to focus this thesis project on Spain.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question, Kenlei, if this is an appropriate time.
Yeah, of course.
This is Yvonne. Monica, great job on your presentation.
Thank you so much.
I just had a question. I wondered what you think the value of a human rights framework for moving towards reproductive justice is. Do you see value in that approach for gaining leverage, or how do you think about your topic in light of sort of human rights approaches?
I think a human rights approach is critical when we're talking about reproductive health, because oftentimes, as I've illustrated throughout this presentation, the framing of reproductive health is not framed as a right. And it's really essential that to access these services, it is framed as a right so that governments are pressured by these international organizations to implement the policies that will grant these rights.
Thank you. That's great.
Would I be able to ask a question right now?
Yes, of course.
So hi, Monica. I just wanted to ask about, so you focused a lot in this presentation, and I assume in your research as well, on the impact to the system that the Franco years and everything that happened, the changes, how they've impacted the current Spanish system on reproductive rights. But I just wanted to ask if you think there's an additional cultural impact, the impact on the minds of the people themselves, and what their view of this, their view of reproductive rights in the context of the way that Franco attacked them, really. Whether the public would view it as a right, or whether, in contrast, maybe Franco disseminated his ideas amongst the population.
Thank you for that question. So that's definitely something I dive more in depth with in my paper, especially as I discuss Francoism and the policies instituted under Franco, especially with El Pacto de Olvido, the Pact of Forgetting. It created what I use the term memoricide, that is drawn from one of my sources in this research project, to explain how the stripping away of memories, or the not acknowledging on a governmental level of the historical atrocities in Spanish society, has created a culture in which, and this is only recently starting to change in the last, I'd say 10 to 20 years, that the atrocities that happened during that 40-year-long dictatorship and the time before that in the Civil War are starting to be acknowledged little by little. Another big impact, as a lot of people who lived throughout the 40-year-long dictatorship, they were educated within an education system that influenced cultural beliefs. So I imagine that there are a lot of people in Spain who would be against, and are still against, abortion legalization and implementing a right-centered model, because they don't view reproductive health care as a right. However, this is not the case with a lot of people. A lot of Spanish feminist groups are fighting for these rights. So I think that would require, definitely I would like to research that more, and it's something I go more in depth with in my paper. But to answer your question, I do think there has been a very personal effect for a lot of different people. And even though I discuss and focus my research on the structures of government and political power impeding reproductive rights, it's very relevant that every person in society has a different experience with these rights and a different opinion related to these rights.
Excellent, thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. Are there any other questions for Monica before we move into a panel between Kyley and Monica? Okay, great. So at this time, I'm going to ask that Kyley turns on her video as well and start off a discussion kind of drawing from the parallels of both of your experiences, both as undergraduate researchers, but also as, sounds like, historians, right? So I kind of want to kick off the conversation between you two about, what are the important takeaways that you guys are seeing, not just for students, but for the general populace, about exploring these historical narratives of past traumas, especially historical narratives that maybe some of us don't have any personal connection with, and what impact that can have on our future.
I would like to, say something along those lines. I think it's, first of all, I'd like to note that I think it's interesting that we have such different majors, but have both taken a historical approach to our research. And I think that draws attention to the importance of framing history. I think looking back on history is often neglected when we're looking at how we make government policies moving forward, or how we structure classroom or education systems moving forward. The history is really important, and the way history is framed is important. So I think both of our research and the way we're choosing to frame it in a very academic context, addressing all the possible points, really informing the history of our research, shows how important it is to look back in history in general.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. This question really resonates with me as well. Outside of RTTP, I predominantly study genocide and atrocity in terms of the history of that. And I've always considered history as kind of our anchor point. We can't move forward unless we look back. There's no way to temporally move forward, to legislatively move forward without having the knowledge of what that looked like in the past. So to my mind, especially looking at where these have failed and where these have fallen apart, looking at these past traumas becomes extremely important, because there's simply no way to prevent those from happening again if we're not aware and connected to those, even that maybe aren't specific to our own personal narratives, those that don't impact us directly, it's important to have a knowledge of those. So I'd say that's where that importance lies.
Great, thank you guys so much. So from that, a quick follow-up of where do you guys see the narrative going now that you've started research? Where would you like to see both of your respective topics move forward, taking in all of this information you've learned under consideration?
I'm sorry, I'm a little unclear about the question. Are you asking where we want to take this project going forward, or where you see this, our research having a place in current day?
I guess, let me reframe. Those are great questions that I want to jump back to later, but I'm thinking more about what do you think, like Monica, for your specific topic in reproductive rights in Spain, what do you think the next step for that society should be to continue to move forward with reproductive rights? And likewise, Kyley, like, do you see any next steps in moving forward our historical understanding and I guess response to what was happening during the historical story that you took on for your project?
I can start with that, Monica, if you don't mind. Is that okay? Sorry, my video is like really jumpy, so it's hard for me to tell what's happening. Especially for my project, particularly because it is about educating people about these things. I think it needs to be better rolled out. I think at this point, people's willingness to look back on these traumas is still very restricted. So I think if we can create an environment where that is less affrontive maybe, or more accessible, I think that's going to be the next step, just to allow people to engage with that history and that narrative a little bit more.
For my project, I think it's important to note that like where I stand in relation to the research I'm doing. So obviously I'm from the US, I'm not from Spain, and for much that I've worked on this project and for much that I've studied Spanish history, I can't say, nor do I have a right to say what should be done in Spanish government, society, or politics. But I do think I can contribute to this discussion here in the United States. And I think also the United States obviously has a lot of political power globally and in international organizations. And I think setting out and encouraging a right-centered approach in all states of America can help inform the international dialogue around reproductive rights globally.
Thank you for taking my awkwardly worded question and answering it beautifully, both of you. Before I open it up to the rest of the guests and participants in this discussion, I do want to kind of go back to what you thought I asked before, but I guess what's next for you guys? What are you hoping to do with these projects now? I mean, Kyley, you kind of already talked on some of that, but how has this project helped form the next steps for you post-graduation?
Well, for me in particular, I probably wouldn't be going to graduate school if I hadn't found RCTP and discovered how much I love teaching. I really want to help educate people about these things. I've met so many people who, when I bring up topics, unfortunately about genocide, that's what I focus on, or atrocity, or just past traumas, there tends to be this method of shutting down. So I think in the future, especially moving into grad school, I'd like to, as I said earlier, create an environment where people can engage with that, but especially through this project in discovering that these things can be tweaked and altered and streamlined to be more accessible to students. I think that's probably where this research is going to take me in the future, and where I hope to take it is to get to the point where we can make these topics, this kind of take down these academic barriers and make these things more accessible, not just to students at university, but just to the general public as well.
Yeah, what grad program are you hoping to attend specifically?
Next year I'll be attending an MA at WSU, Washington State University, history.
History, okay. Thank you. And Monica?
So in the fall, I'll be moving to Spain. I am really passionate about the culture. I really want the experience of living in that country. So I'm going to be going there through a program called Auxiliar, in which I'll be assisting and teaching English. It's a program run through the Spanish government. And I also anticipate, before I had done this research project and gone through, I had never really done this level of research before, or really any research like this before. And doing this project and seeing how passionate I became on it and how exciting it was for me, and also how much I liked just reading through the sources and narrowing down on a topic, has definitely motivated me to start thinking about grad school in the future, and also start thinking about other research projects and the possibility of maybe going into academia in my future. But I think right now I'm just focusing on the next step is moving to Spain.
Thank you guys both so much. So at this point, I'd like to open up the dialogue to our co-host, Abby, who has been supporting us so much from the back end of this, seeing if she has any questions or if anyone else from the audience has any questions for our panelists.
Hi, thanks so much, Kenlei and Monica, Kyley. It's been a pleasure to be listening to your presentations. Thank you so much. I am curious, you've spoken a bit about the appetite for addressing these different issues and for people to consider fully, you know, the implications of, for instance, genocide. You were talking about, Kyley, and Monica, you spoke about taking a human rights approach, and I'm just wondering about the implications in the current climate, thinking about how there's a lot of, you know, cross-cultural international trauma unfolding right now, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on what people's appetites are going to look like to be willing to dialogue in meaningful ways about these topics. And if you have any suggestions for how to have difficult conversations in times like these, or if you've learned anything in considerations of your research.
I'll speak to this first. I think that what's currently going on, actually, I see many connections between all of us that are being formed that weren't before. I think we're able to connect in a different way. I think people value connections and value connecting over certain topics and coming together over certain topics in a way that they didn't before all this was going on. And so I like to look at it as an opportunity. I think it's a really amazing opportunity for activist groups to move mobilizations to an online format. I also think in processing kind of like the trauma that's occurred over and like the hardships that are occurring for people right now on a global setting, I think people will be very willing to examine these issues, especially given what I've seen from people just in terms of kindness, just in terms of being aware and being empathetic about other people's struggles. I think people will be open to addressing these issues in a new way that they haven't before.
Yeah, I think, Monica, I definitely agree with you about how much people are going to be willing to kind of engage with the historical narrative, having endured their own struggles right now. But I don't know if I would agree entirely with the forging of connections in this crisis. From my research, crisis always breeds animosity, and I'm not necessarily sure that the results of this are going to be positive. There's a certain anonymity in moving things online that I think we might find escalating certain topics. And it'll be interesting to compare that to the historical record and just to see how these situations arise. But I do think that we might see some more difficulties ahead.
And I just wanted to clarify, I didn't mean to say that I thought that the results would be positive, just that I think there could be spaces where positive things could occur in this time.
No, so I totally understand that. Sorry, I was just saying overall.
Really good discussion. I think I'm actually wondering if, with your given projects, if you were to have to redo some of this during the current pandemic, would anything have changed?
My project was conducted directly in person with students, so I don't think my project would be possible in the current circumstances. We're trying to teach RTTP online now, and while it is going better than I think many of us anticipated, it is still a struggle, and I don't think revisiting a game in the way that we did in these circumstances would be possible still.
Revisiting this in this current climate, I think I'm actually still working on finishing up my paper and plan on incorporating some points, bringing it into the present moment. But I think if the whole time that I was working on this project, this was going on, well, it would be very hard to do motivation-wise, but I think also I would have just drawn in current research that is happening, but I don't know whether it would have dramatically changed my research in any way.
Thank you. Any other questions for our panelists? I do have another question to keep the dialogue going, is talking about the challenges that you overcame when doing these projects. You've already talked a little bit about some of them, but if you had to identify one thing that was the largest adversity you had to overcome, what was that and how did you overcome it?
Time frame was the time frame for my project specifically. I chose to, though there was a lot of planning, it was really implemented the same term that we were teaching the game. So it was a lot of on my feet thinking. And the only way to overcome that was through the help of everyone in the class and understanding from the students and feedback from the students. So I was really lucky to have such a terrific class to do this with. But yeah, time frame was a big one.
For me, I'd say there were probably 2 points I would consider to be the biggest hurdles. The first one was starting the writing process. So I had drafted my ideas and I had a pretty clear guideline and a pretty clear research direction, but starting the writing process was incredibly challenging because I had so much in my head, and narrowing it down on paper seemed insurmountable at first, but getting past that initial just starting to write made the process a lot easier. And I'd say the other barrier, the other challenge was when everything happened as it's happening now. And I can imagine with your research as well, Kyley, it's really hard to stay motivated right now. And it's really hard to keep a constant flow of work. And it's really hard to stay passionate about the things you were working on before this was happening. So I'd say throughout the last couple months, it's definitely been a challenge keeping that motivation and continuing to work on the project, which is why I'm so grateful for my advisor, Professor Yvonne Braun, for the help she's given.
Great. Any other questions? Great. So I guess before then we close the session off, I want to know if you guys have any final thoughts about how this experience has changed you, or if all of us left the session today with one thought in mind, what would it be? so open-ended, I know.
I think for me, history is important. Learning about history is important, but also educating about history is equally as important. Also that doing research is important. Yeah, I didn't know how important research was until I started this process, and I realized the implications of my personal research, and then just starting to think about the implications, it makes it easier to start to think about the implications of a lot of different types of research.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that as well. I think if to leave with any thought, it's that research, learning, education, engagement, they all take so many different forms. And it doesn't necessarily have to look the way it does traditionally. Educating and learning is a give and take, and it can be so flexible. So I think that's something to take away from the session.
I definitely got both of those points from this whole conversation, so I think that's a win. So with that, I just want to express my gratitude for letting me moderate your guys' session today. I feel like I learned a ton, and I am just so proud to be an advisor for both of your majors, because I know that these types of amazing projects are just prime examples of what our students are able to accomplish, but also just like showing what rock stars you both are. So thank you so much for letting me moderate and letting all of our guests participate today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. But feel free to log off. After this, just so you know, the recording will be live on YouTube on the UO's channel at some point in the next week, I believe. So you can share it with all your friends.
Brilliant. Thank you so much again.
Yep. Bye.
Yeah, thank you so much.